It's nice to see so many people here to celebrate International Women's Day, and it's nice to see so many men come along and support us celebrating International Women's Day. I take pleasure in welcoming you to the Antonine Wall Women on the Wall event. That's quite a mouthful at this time in the morning. As part of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project, we'll hear from 5 speakers about the women who lived on and around the Antonine Wall during the Roman occupation. We will also hear about the relationship of other women with the wall in later years. Many of us are so lucky to live so close to the UNESCO World Heritage Site. The Antonine Wall is often underappreciated and unknown by many. The Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project has, in its first year, made great progress in raising awareness of the wall through the creation of play parks, a series of community projects, and the start of an education programme with the local schools along the line of the wall. The 21st Century Legion programme has allowed for a number of volunteers to become engaged with the project and to help raise awareness of the wall and the project. This year will see the installation of a replica distance stone and sculpture at Nether Croy and a Roman-themed play park at Auchenstary. This event has been organised in response to a request, as Claire said, from the Optimist group in Clyside, who wanted to find out if women lived on the wall during the Roman occupation, and if so, what were their roles. Patricia Week, from the Antonine Wall World Heritage Site Coordinator at Historic Environment Scotland, will provide an introduction to some of the women who lived in and around the wall during the Roman occupation, using evidence from artefacts found on or adjacent to the wall. Dr. Eliza Mckinnis from the University of Glasgow will showcase her research into the colours of the Antonine Wall distance stones. Professor David Breeze will speak about the issues facing women travelling with the Roman army. Professor Lawrence Kepi will discuss the work of Anne Robertson, a prominent archaeologist who created a silent film of archaeologists walking along the wall in the 1950s. And finally, local historian Maura Cross will talk about 18th and 19th century women who have had links with the walls. After the presentation, we will have an opportunity to handle replicas of everyday objects that have been found along the wall, many of them at Barhill Fort. The Rediscovering the Antonine Wall team will also be asking for your views on community projects. A buffet lunch will also be served, and Christine from Cycling Without Age will have a try-shot for you out in the car park to try. I've already had a wee shot in it on my way in, so take the most of it and get out there and enjoy it. So please join me and welcome the speakers along this morning.
Okay, my name is Tricia Weeks. I'm the Antonine Wall Coordinator, and I'm just going to give you a very brief flavour this morning of some of the evidence that we have for women on the wall. It's brief because it's quite scarce, and we have to piece together a lot of information from actually very little evidence. So don't be surprised that this is only going to take about 5 or 10 minutes. So the first thing we have to evidence women along the Antonine Wall are the shoes they left behind. And I know it's a wee bit of a cliche, but the shoes are incredibly good evidence, not just for women, but also for children and for the soldiers along the wall. We have here 3 different shoes along the Antonine Wall, and the largest belongs to a soldier, so this one here, and this one is actually a woman's shoe, and they were all found at Barhill in waterlogged deposits, and that's how they've survived so well, because it's very rare to get leather surviving in most archaeological sites unless we have waterlogged deposits. And then the tiny one here is actually a toddler-sized shoe, and we know that because we actually got these remade. And when we thought it was actually an older child, like a 4 or 5-year-old, but when we got it made, the dimensions actually turned out to be for sort of 2-year-old, 3-year-old at the most. So we know that women were living along the wall, that they were either with their husbands at the forts. So in the case of the commanding officers at the forts, they could bring their families with them, and we know that was the case at several sites, and I'll show you some more evidence for this. But we also know that some soldiers entered into relationships with local women, so they may have had families living outside the fort as well. Is that better? Okay. I can't see the slides. Okay. There we go. So the second piece of evidence that we have are some of the sculptures, and I'm not going into too much detail because I know Louise is going to talk about the distance slabs, but we have a series of gravestones along the Antonine wall. Most of these are for men, most of them are for soldiers who were serving on the wall and then buried alongside it. But we actually have this grave slab from Sherva, so just along the road, which actually has a woman on it, depicted on it. And we know this because of the dress that she's wearing and the hairstyle. And she's actually sitting on a coach, which is being pulled by, I think that's cattle rather than a horse. Lawrence can tell us a bit more about it later. And then we have a second one down here, which for a while was thought to be her husband, but actually, in reality, is probably more likely to be another version of this same lady, because the dress is the same and the hairstyle is exactly the same. And in this one, she actually has her pet dog with her. This was part of a tombstone to the woman, so she's probably the wife of a commanding officer, living either at Twecker or somewhere near Bar Hill. Then we have the evidence for names, so we actually begin to move into evidence for named individuals, which again is quite slight. I'm afraid this is not a very exciting slide, but it's a very important one because it actually has a name on it, and that name is Materna. So you can see the M-A-T-E-R-N-A coming through here. And there's actually two evidences of her name from Falkirk, from the site at Monumental. And they're scratched onto pottery, and it's a particular kind of pottery called Samian ware, and we have a couple of replicas at the back of the Samian ware if you want to see what it is. And Samian is your very expensive china. It's your best dinner service, so it's the stuff that you would be keeping for special occasions. It wouldn't have been used by all of the soldiers, it would have been used by the higher ranking officers at the site or by the commanding officer and his family. So there's a good chance that Materna was probably the wife of a commanding officer at Monumental. And probably she scratched her name on it so that nobody actually goes off with it. It's a symbol of how far she's come, how important she is, that she can afford to import this Samian ware. And Samian was imported from France. So it's coming a very long distribution and trade trail, all the way from France up through England, up the Roman roads or by sea along the coast. So it's very labour intensive to get, very expensive to buy. And it wasn't just Materna that was doing this. She was accompanied in writing her name on her pottery by other women along the wall. And this is from Camelon, which is actually just off the line of the wall. It's just slightly to the north by Falkirk. And this is Aurelia, who again is probably, so we've got the A-R-E-L-I-A. And again, she's probably the wife of the commanding officer, and she's marking her Samian to show that it belongs to her. So I'm sure everyone has the experience of fighting over, you know, mothers and grandmothers' plates when it comes to distributing them. So she's laid claim to these. And I mentioned we have gravestones. This is the only one really that we have with a name of a Roman female on it. And this again is from Sherva, just to the west of Bar Hill. And this one is to a lady called Verecunda. And it's very unusual because it only has her name on it. Usually Roman gravestones will have a dedication or much more information about the person and where they came from and who they were related to. This one just has this inscription here, DM, which stands for Dis Manibus, and Verecunda. And that just means it's a sort of a grave dedication. And Verecunda is thought to be a slave based at Bar Hill, and she was probably in the employ of, again, one of the commanding officers or a high-ranking soldier there. And it's not clear why this grave was erected to her. She obviously meant a lot to that particular person, so maybe she was a slave who later became associated with the officer, you know, entered into a relationship with him, or something along those lines. What's clear is she wasn't a free woman, she wasn't one of the wives, the official wives of the commanding officers. And then this is probably the most interesting one in terms of stories about women on the wall. This is an altar which was erected at Westerwood, so just to the other side of Cumbernauld. And this is by a lady called Vibia Piccata. And I can't quite see from the angle map, but her name is inscribed just in here. And she was the wife of a soldier called Flavius Veracundus, who was based at Westerwood. And what's interesting is that we actually know a lot about their life history from stones that come from elsewhere in the Roman Empire, and also from archival records that the Romans left behind. Because the Romans were very good at keeping records, so we know where soldiers served, how they moved around the empire, and how they moved to Scotland from other places. And in Vibia Piccata's case, this altar is erected to the gods and goddesses of the crossroads. So it may be that she's planning a journey, it may be that she's giving thanks for a journey. And that's important when we know a little bit about her life history, because her name is actually of North African origin. So she's probably born and brought up somewhere in the north of Africa. And her husband is recorded as having worked in a place called Pannonia. And Pannonia is on the very edge of the empire in the east. So she's coming from somewhere in this section, and he is somewhere over here. And at some point he is stationed, presumably in North Africa, and meets her. He does have a previous wife, he has a first wife, she's his second wife. And they move from Pannonia, or they're in North Africa, to Pannonia, all the way up to Scotland. So they're actually travelling an immense distance in what's actually, 2,000 years ago, with far fewer travel opportunities than we have today. They're moving around. So she has a very interesting life, and clearly there's a lot going on. There's a lot of culture, a lot of ideas being generated and moving around the empire at this point. So don't think of it as just being Roman soldiers on the wall. There's actually a lot of women, and there's a lot of very well educated women, and women who have a huge part to play in Roman society.
And thank you for inviting me here today. As Tricia says, my work is focused on the Antonine wall distance stones, but also more broadly on Roman sculpture, and I'm pushing my research now into, in fact, broader geographical areas. So I'm going to be looking at Roman sculpture in other parts of the empire, other frontier regions, but also into early medieval sculpture as well. So I'm really interested to see how these objects would have looked in the past. And so hopefully, although my work isn't necessarily totally focused on women, we'll be touching upon some of the women on the wall. I'm asked to put this slide up here, really, as Tricia says, to make you aware that my research is generously funded by Historic Environment Scotland, and that's because it contributes to Scotland's archaeological strategy. So I'm very pleased and honoured to be funded through that strand, because I think everything that we're doing here is an inclusive way to promote Scottish archaeology in lots of different contexts. So I put this first slide up here really to sort of ask you to think about colour. We're surrounded by colour. Everything we do is in colour. We don't live in a monochrome world. We have lots of different shades of colour. We are immersed in colour in every aspect of our day-to-day life. And so I think this phraseology here a bit by Jones McGregor, I think that captures quite nicely how important colour is to us, because as it says here, you probably can't read it, I'll very quickly read it out for you. Colour shapes our world in profound, if sometimes subtle ways. It helps us to classify, form opinions and make aesthetic emotional judgments. Colour operates in every culture as a symbol, a metaphor, and as part of our aesthetic system. Yet archaeologists have traditionally subordinated the study of colour to form and material value of the objects they find, and thereby overlook its impact on conceptual systems through human history. So in other words, oftentimes when an archaeologist is reporting on finds, they are not necessarily picking up on colour. They are telling you a lot about the objects, but they're not necessarily dealing with that one very important, significant part of it, which is the colour. And we know that colour was very important in the Roman world. We found these wonderful pots of paint pigments in Pompeii, which is obviously beautifully, if tragically, preserved after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius there. And if we needed more proof, we can, if anyone's ever visited Pompeii, you'll see there's lots of villas, lots of buildings there that are adorned with these beautiful, vibrant colours. And that's where my research comes from. I feel quite confident that the stones and the sculptures that we're seeing here in Scotland were most likely coloured in the same ways we see them in other parts of the empire. I have this slide up just in case people aren't all aware of the Antonine Wall. I won't go into it in detail, but it's really just to show you that the wall that we talk about as the Antonine Wall was constructed in 142 AD under the directive of the Emperor Antoninus Pius. It's a turf rampart, so it's unlike Hadrian's Wall, which is a stone structure. And it cleaved a route effectively from the Clyde, across from the Clyde to the Fourth Isthmus. There are 17 forts along it, interspersed by different fortlets, and it was built by, we know of anyway, 3 different Roman legions, the 2nd, the 6th and the 20th legions. I'm here to talk about the distance stones. I don't know if any of you are aware of them. Most of them are in the Hunterian Museum. There is one really significant one built into the wall of the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh. But what are they? Well, some context. In archaeology, our key kind of questions that we tend to ask are who, why, what, where, when. Now, the distance stones are effectively, they're a record of the building of the Antonine Wall, and they are dedications to the emperor and dedicated a commemoration, if you like, of the troops who built the wall in 142 AD. Now, we think they were embedded into the wall or on structures that were possibly beside the wall, and we know that because there are cramp holes on the back and on the sides of the stones. So these are very heavy things. We know who built them, and we know who engaged with them, because we know that the Roman soldiers would have engaged with them. They are inscribed with Latin text, abbreviated Latin text, and here's an example of one of them. This is a Somerson Farm stone, and it's quite... some of them have been described as template insofar as we often see text in the middle. It's abbreviated Latin text, so it's Latin but not as you know it. It is very prescriptive text, and often there are decorative features on either side of that Latin text. Not all of them. Some of them are just a plain bordered text. But others like this example here, are very highly decorated. And they tell us a really interesting story. They speak to us about, if we look at the iconography, they talk to us about battle. They talk to us, we see here, the goddess Victory. She is commemorating a Roman cavalryman who has been in battle with some northern warriors who are captured at the bottom here. They have had their hands bound behind their back. They're prisoners of war, if you like. And on the right side, we usually have some symbolism associated with the army. So we have the eagle, which is the representative of Rome, and we have a Capricorn, and below them another captive northern warrior. And this is the text I was speaking to you about. It is an abbreviated Latinized text. It tells us that the stone is dedicated to the Emperor Antoninus Pius, and this is dedicated by the Legio II, the 2nd Legion. And these stones are traditionally termed distance stones or distance slabs, some of my colleagues will be calling them. And that is because they have distances actually engraved onto them, and they're very unique things. They are not they're not emulated elsewhere in the empire, and they're very important because they help us to understand who was building what and how these troops, how much of the frontier infrastructure each of these groups of legions were actually contributing to the structure. So monumental text is a really important part of the Roman Empire, especially it was particularly prolific in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, which is fortuitously when we're talking about. They are generally very visibly prominent. They're put in very important places where you'll see a lot of traffic footfall coming along and seeing people coming along and seeing the actual the monumental text. They are lasting significance. So effectively we still use the term written in stone, and that's really where this comes from. From the Roman period, we're talking about lending a sense of permanence to often it's treaties, legal documents, or a commemoration, or a religious moment, if you like. So it's a very important way of Romans to not just have text written on on paper or, on script, but actually on a permanent piece of stone on the wall. From our perspective, we have the duality of the text informing the sculptures and vice versa. So if you might not be able to read Latin, or you may not be able to read that abbreviated format of Latin that we were seeing, but you certainly would be able to, I'm sure, interpret what was meant by the iconography in these sculptures. We're seeing scenes of battle often, we're seeing religious celebrations, and we're seeing lots of activities that we would have been ongoing on the frontier. So they do provide a sense of permanence and a period of great change during the 2nd century when the Romans were here. So my interest in these stones is, as I mentioned, is about colour. We know that some of these monumental texts had colour on them. Some of them, I'm not sure how well you can see the text on these ones. This is a commemoration stone to the Emperor Hadrian. It's found in Egypt. And some of the text on there, we can still see traces of red pigment. Other stones from parts of the empire here, Pannonia Inferior, in Serbia, we have an altar, and we can still see red in the text there. And so that's quite common. It's often very washed out, we can't see it very well, but there are tantalising traces, if you like, of colour in some of these monumental texts. I've put this up because this was an archaeology programme that was on recently, and it was just really interesting. This is Bethany Hughes, who was over in Egypt, and she was there present when her colleagues were uncovering a new stelae, a funerary monument. And I love this piece. I took a capture of my TV screen because of her expression, and her expression is one of awe and wonder. She's left speechless because as the piece is being uncovered before her eyes, colour is revealed. And I think, although archaeologists don't always mention this in the text and in the reports that they're writing, actually, if you're the person that has first seen this thing for thousands of years and colour reveals itself to you, it's an emotional moment, and she actually gets quite tearful about it because she's so overwhelmed by it. And I think any archaeologist finding a stone, if we were to find a new stone today, we might well find it with colour because it hasn't been washed, it hasn't been impacted upon, and I'm pretty sure that would be my face if I found one anyway. And of course we know that sandstone sculptures, which is what our stones are made from, sandstone, and we know that they were coloured right back from Egyptian times. We have some examples here from Kamombo Temple in Egypt. And my interest here is because, as you all know, when you go to museums, whether it's the British Museum or the National Museum of Scotland, any museum, if we see classical statues, they are pristine generally, they are white, they are presented to us as beautifully clean objects, but in fact, as Marlowe tells us way back in 1956, Athens was never white, but her statues bereft of colour have conditioned the artistic sensibilities of Europe. The whole past has reached us colourless. That's not the way it would have been, and we know that because if we look at, if anyone's ever been to the British museums, these are some of the Parthenon Marbles. They are life-sized marble, beautifully articulated pieces that once graced the pediments of the Parthenon in Athens. And despite the best efforts of some of the curatorial staff to present these beautifully white, where they scrubbed them and bleached them, took surface treatments off of them. Some lovely traces are still remaining. They're quite well hidden, you have to look hard for them, but they're usually in crevices that the viewing public wouldn't necessarily see. So we've got to look hard, but we've seen blues and browns and yellows still on some of these pieces. And that's inspired me to start thinking about how would ours would have looked? Would ours have been coloured as well? We've got some beautiful examples of statuary from the Roman period. Here's the Prima Porta Augusta. It's a very famous statue of Augustus, and it was found with traces of colour. They were very faded, and we have some colleagues who have, that's a plaster cast reproduction of it, and from the traces that were visible when it was discovered in the 19th century, they have reproduced this. That's how it would have, that's how the representation of how it would have looked. I think that's a bit bright. I think there would have been more realistic colours there, but the important thing is this thing was meant to be coloured. We have an emperor here. He is resplendent in his red cloak, but he also has some beautifully articulated scenes that are important to his status as an emperor in the 1st century. But we have also some beautifully reconstructed versions of other Roman statues. So this bust of the true head from Esconine Hill in Rome. Now, she looks like a bit dirty. She's not been cleaned very well, but in fact, these are traces of pigment still left on the skin. You can see the close-up here. There's traces of colour left on her lips and on her cheek. And we've had some, not me, but colleagues on the continent have done some really interesting research on her, and we've been able to reproduce how she would have looked. That's a digital reproduction, and I think you'll agree, it gives a whole other dimension to what was already a beautiful piece. Now we see, you know, a real life person coming to the fore, and I think that's how we need to think about how these statues would have looked. We even have representations of painted statues, so if we needed any further proof that statues would have been painted in realistic colours, I think we have them here. We have a statue of Mars that's in the Vatican Museum now, and we even have a very small intaglio, which is a glass paste that would have graced a signet ring. And here we have a Greek artist painting the bust of a Roman woman. And a final one that I really enjoy is there's women here. Here we have a woman artist. She is she's painting a statue or a picture of a statue. What she has at her feet is an image, and it's not clear whether she's painting the image or she's painting the statue. But I think actually, I like to think of the little picture as her template. She knows how that statue should look, and this is what she's bringing around with her as a part of her kit, her painting kit, so that she knows she gets the right colour. Now that's my hypothesis. I could be completely off, but I quite like that idea. And I like that it's all women represented in this picture. If we needed more proof, there's the Ara Paris, the Altar of Peace in Rome, and we have very clear traces of colour on that. We're using modern technology to understand how that piece would have looked with full colour. So we can see quite clearly that these statues would have had colour. They are all marble statues that we've been looking at today. So ours differs, say, because we have our Bridgeness Stones and other statues from Antonine Wall are sandstone, which is different. And I've always been interested in the colour. There is one in the Hunterian Museum that has traces of colour, and my work started with this stone. It used to be built into Dunnottar Castle. I'm sure some of you will have seen that off the coast of northeast of Scotland. And this, I was able to demonstrate that in fact this stone was painted in the 16th or 17th century because of the ingredients that were used in the paint upon it. So if you ever go to the Hunterian and you look at that stone, you will see traces of it, but they are not original traces. I tend to think that in fact maybe they were painted because when the stone was discovered there could well have been traces upon it, and that's why maybe the owner was then driven to actually repaint it, built it into the castle walls. So, non-destructive analysis, I'm using portable X-ray fluorescence, which is effectively beaming X-rays at the stones to see if we can pick up traces of the elements that would have been present in the pigments used. Non-destructive analysis is really important because curators don't like it when we come in and take samples from their wonderful artwork. So it's very important that we're able to give them that kind of confidence to say, we're not going to harm your beautiful objects. We want to see if we can use these emerging technologies to understand and recreate these colours. And this is a technique that's now being widely used in art history to understand paintings as well, because we don't always know what the our Renaissance painters are using as well. We're using them on Roman frescoes, on Greek statues as well. So they're being widely applied, these portable technologies. So that gives us the elements, but it doesn't tell us what the compositions of the pigments are. For that, I need to use a Raman spectrometer, which is able to actually give us the mineral compound, so we can then understand what the pigment is, not just the elements that are present. So that allows us to kind of fingerprint, if you like, these pigments and recreate them. So, I'm not going to go into the science of it all and bore you to death with all of that, but suffice to say that this is the palette that has come out of my work, and we're able to see that our colours on the Antonine wallstones, the colours that survive for our analysis anyway, are dominated by reds and yellows and some white. The palette is extended if we go down to Hadrian's Wall, because I have used the techniques down there as well. The results are impacted in a sense, trying to mitigate some of the issues that have arisen, and that's because our stones have been washed quite extensively. So any traces that were on them, after having of course been buried in the ground for 2,000 years, which has had its own impact, they were taken straight from excavation into a museum and they haven't been interfered with. So another kind of important part of my work is to kind of look at how we impact them in the present day as well. And I've been doing some experimental work on how this pigment would have worked on the sandstone itself as well, because we are going to be recreating some of these. My work is informing the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project team, because one of the replica stones that is being sculpted will be painted. So we'll be able to paint it with authentic colours, and we'll understand that process, and we'll be able to track how the environment impacts that too. So, how would it have looked? How would these stones have looked with colour? Well, this is the Bridgeness Stone that I mentioned from the National Museum of Scotland. This is a similar kind of template format to the Somerson Farm, but this is a scene mid-battle. It's quite a brutal scene of battle. We have the cavalryman, the familiar cavalryman there. He's stomping all over some Indigenous warriors. One of them has been decapitated, and I've been able to show that, in fact, if we think about the colour, the authentic colours that were applied there, we can see this representation. We didn't go and paint that stone. This is a digital representation, and it's showing how that scene would have been brought to life with colour, and we can see the decapitated head of this warrior here. We've got traces of blood red at the neck and at the base of the skull after it's been decapitated. So it's not just about putting red on. If you think back on the Prima Porta Augustus, yes, there was colour there, but it was pretty bold. There's no subtlety to that, and I think actually if we think about the frescoes that we saw at the beginning of our slides, they were very lifelike, and I think our stones would have been similarly lifelike as well. So that's how it would have looked. But how does that help us today? I'm thinking about women in sculpture. Trisha's set the scene very nicely for us. But I'm thinking about, as I mentioned, my work's going to take me wider than the Antonine Wall, and we have lots of representations of women on other frontiers, generally in similar gravestones, often as part of a family group in a grave sculpture like this one from Noricum in Austria. We have other examples of family stelae, funerary sculptures from Germany. But we also have women on their own. I don't know if you can quite make out this lady on a matron from a German funerary sculpture, but actually in the folds of her dress and her face we can see some white there. That tells me there was a base of gesso there, like a plaster-like structure that was put on and then she was painted. So often that wills her eye, and in the creases that I mentioned before, which are not always very well cleaned. So I think she was painted. We've got some other statues of women from Germany here. This one was part of a pair. She was, it's a freestanding sculpture with her husband. But we also have other slaves, servant girls, who are represented in these funerary monuments as well. They normally have, they're serving wine with flagons, or they're carrying plates of food. So again, there's one from Noricum in Australia. I don't know again if you can make that out, but her dress does have colour on it. And these are some of the ones that I'm going to be hopefully doing some analysis on, so that we can try to extrapolate how they would have looked with colour. We've also got examples of women holding up buildings, women in architecture, and a digital representation of how that would have looked with colour. We know that colour survives on them. But what's missing from this picture? Where are all the women on the Antonine wall? Tricia has touched upon them. Yeah, there's the Shirva gravestone with the reclining lady, probably the commander's wife. But then we've got others that are hidden in plain sight. We have women represented as goddesses all over these stones. We have two goddess victories holding up this tablet from Braidfield Farm in Dundalk. We have a reclining winged victory here from Old Kilpatrick. So another goddess here. Goddesses are really important. There's lots of females, but we don't always think about them in that sense when we're looking at these stones, because they are military objects, and we think of the men who were dedicating them, not the women that are represented upon them. And again, I bring you back to the Somerson Farm, where we have the goddess victory there. Here we have the goddess Britannia, who is again honouring a Roman legionary. So lots of women represented. Again, some altars here. We have altars. I can't even read that from here. We have some goddesses here: Fortuna, Minerva, and also to the parade ground goddesses and Britannia. So they were hedging their bets, these guys. They weren't only looking for the gods and goddesses to protect them in their endeavours here in Scotland, but they were also looking for local gods as well. We've got examples of local gods being honoured, asked for help there as well. And we know from other polychrome reliefs, which are sculptures that come out of a flat surface, we know from other examples that they were coloured. Here's a goddess Roma with a small Nike. You can see quite clearly that they're coloured. Victory is coloured here in two different representations from Pompeii. And I'm thinking, can we imagine the colours that I've been talking about today from our distance stone on to some of the women? There's another woman represented with Brigantia. That's a Romano-British goddess, and she is here represented in the form of Minerva. And so that was a sculpture from Birrens. If we think about how these colours that I'm working in would have looked on that beautiful statue of Brigantia, I think it gives us a taste of how the wall would have been coloured. So I'm going to just finish off now, but I know my colleagues are going to talk about women on the wall as well, but I wanted to think about much of what we know about the wall is dominated by male voices. So we talk about the soldiers, the army on the wall, but also most of the colleagues who have done their investigations on the wall, who have written about the wall, are male. We hear a lot of male voices. Women's voices are often largely silent, but they're there. Traces are there of them if we go and look for them. This is the Archaeological Society of Glasgow Archaeological Society, and if we look very closely, we see a woman in the midst of all those males, and a child as well. My colleague Lawrence Kepi is going to talk about Anne Robertson today. She's a prolific scholar who worked on the wall quite recently. She has written extensively on the wall. She's done a walking the wall video, part of which is going to be reproduced as part of this project. But she's a very important woman who has worked on the wall. But to bring it up to date, we're starting to see women coming through in this field. Up until very recently, Eliza Mckinnis was the head of World Heritage, which took on the Antonine Wall. It was the looking after the wall was part of her remit. The current head of World Archaeology and World Heritage is Dr. Rebecca Jones, who's also a woman. Tricia Weeks, she's in charge of the wall now. And then we have Severine and her colleague Emma McMillan, who's the manager of the Rediscovering the Antonine Wall project. So we're seeing lots of women now looking at the wall. We're starting to see women's voices come through. And I'm very pleased to say that we have one of our new stones is going to be a new imagined representation of a distance stone from a local perspective in Falkirk, and one of the stonemasons that's going to be doing that is a woman. So I'm thrilled to see that. And if you'd allow me, I'd like to put myself in the picture as well, because I'm a woman working on the wall, and I'm very pleased about that. So hopefully we'll see more of these voices coming through. All right, thank you so much.
This is my uncle Billy, my mum's cousin, and his second wife, my Auntie Minnie. In the First World War, he served in the forces, and his wife had an affair, and he divorced her. This is his younger brother, Colin, obviously on his wedding day. In the Second World War, he served, and his wife had an affair, but they stayed together. Now, the point I'm making is very straightforward. We think in terms of men at war, but military service also had an effect on their winning fate. My friend Beryl, now in her 80s, whose husband served national service in Germany when they were engaged, said that every relationship which wasn't sanctified by an engagement or a marriage was broken by military service in Germany. So, we start from there, and we have to start from the soldiers, because we have more information about those as we have been hearing. These are two soldiers of the type that served on the Antonine Wall, one's infantry, one's cavalry. And you will hear people say, very frequently, that Roman soldiers were not allowed to marry. This is not quite true. If you look at tombstones, this is actually one at Wales, you will see that it states, there we go. So he's called Aurelius Circulanus, he's a cavalryman, he lived 28 years, and he was put up by his conjugal, his wife. He was a serving soldier and married. So, what's all this about? This is the Emperor Septimius Severus, his coin. And he allowed Roman soldiers to marry. But the Roman Empire was organised in social terms slightly different than our world. I'm going to illustrate this by a person you know perfectly well, St. Paul. So this, I'm sorry about the slide, it's taken from a long distance, I've blown it up. It's in the Church of Santa Pudenziana in Rome. Once the Coriolanus virus is gone, go to Rome, look at it, because it's got the very earliest representation of the saints on it, all dressed up as Roman senators, and this is St. Paul. Now, St. Paul, as you know, came from Tarsus, no mean city. But after he was scourged, he said, "You can't do this to me, I'm a Roman citizen." And this is the point. There's a distinction. You could be a member of a city. I've been in Edinburgh for 50 years. I'm a citizen of Edinburgh. You could also argue I'm a citizen of Scotland, as it were a bigger city. You have a distinction. So here St. Paul is not only a citizen of Tarsus, but he's also a Roman citizen. A slightly different social element. And the distinction here is, you could not marry as a Roman citizen, but you could make a marriage as a citizen of your local city. And this document, which I'm not going to read for you, is a certificate which was given to a Roman soldier on the Antonine Wall when he retired. And it allowed him to marry, if I can find the word, he's allowed to marry Kumuxor. He's allowed to marry according to Roman law, with a specific word, Canuvum. He's allowed to marry according to Roman law, but the army, the state, recognised that he might have already married according to local custom, and indeed he might have children already. So the army says, okay, you can retire after 25 years, we'll give citizenship to any woman you might be already married to, or you might marry in the future, but only one woman, and we'll give citizenship to children you might already have. So the state is recognising the realities of life. You can't marry according to Roman law, and therefore you're not recognised. If you move somewhere else, you don't get any money to transport your wife and family, but they recognise you might already have married, and therefore you have, as did our first soldier, Aurelius, have a wife, communes. So that's just getting that one out of the way, because everybody seems to think that you couldn't marry, but of course soldiers made relationships. And the soldier who retired into civil life, therefore, might already have a wife and children. As a matter of interest, soldiers tended to join the army between 18 and 21, but not get married for another 10 years once they got first step on the line of promotion. And we've studied tombstones, and we're pretty well sure of this. That bloke was 28, and he got a wife, and we saw at the beginning. Now, these Roman soldiers are not static. They had a base, a Roman fort, but they moved around. They went on specific duties to collect supplies. They might be outposted away from their base. And in these cases, what happened to their womenfolk? This is not a lapse from the Antonine Wall, but I want to use it from South Shields because this is clearly a tombstone erected by a man who thought a lot about his wife. It costs a lot of money to create this, and it illustrates another aspect of Roman life. They had slaves. But you could free your slave. Spartacus was on television recently. That was a good one about slaves. You could free your slave, as this man did, who created this tombstone, Barates, and he married her. So when we're thinking about relationships, this is one aspect of it. A man who acquired a slave, bought her presumably, freed her, married her, she died at South Shields, and we got this enormous, wonderful tombstone, which is a reflection of what assumes of his affection for her. Here's another family photograph. Because marriages are complicated. This is my grandfather in the middle. In 1915. A year before this was taken, his first wife had died. Mountain Ellie. She was 7. He worked. This was before pensions. What do? You get remarried. Within a year, he'd been married. And my dad, who was the only child of this union, was of a very clear view that this man, who was my grandfather's business partner, and they would join us together, said, "Oh, I've got an unmarried stepdaughter. Are you interested?" So this is my grandmother, and this was a marriage of convenience. It is a world we no longer inhabit in the same way. If you worked as a man and you lost your wife and you had children, you need to remarry. My uncle Reg isn't taught that. He was in the army, but his mother-in-law actually married 3 times, producing 2 children of each marriage, until the 3rd one, and they had 3 children, and that bust the whole system. But if you're a man, you have to be married. If you're a woman, you have no other income and children, so you have to be married. So marriage of convenience is something which was presumably equally important in the Roman world, where life expectancy was 40, and if you lost your spouse, you wanted another one to look after you and to provide you with an income. So that's another aspect of Roman military life. Now this is a very interesting photograph for me. These people, including women, are climbing up to look at the remains of a Roman camp in Spain. And we know something about this Roman camp in Spain. We actually have 5 anecdotes about what happened when Scipio Aemilianus arrived here in the 2nd century BC to take command of the army. And in this camp, he found there were 2,000 women of loose morals, prostitutes, and he threw them out. So this is another example, an important example of life in the army. There are loose women around, wanting to earn money. And this is illustrated for us very clearly by an inscription which comes from Egypt, from Coptos, and it's about the money you would pay if you were crossing the desert by any one of these routes to the Red Sea. This is the inscription, and it records how much you pay. So, if you come down to this, it doesn't matter, these are singled out. So for soldiers women, for sailors women, you pay 20 drachmae. Prostitutes had to pay over 5 times that in customs duties. So it gives you an idea of aspects of life on the frontier. Overnight, they would all have to stay in these little command posts, and these have produced an inscription, a letter rather, from a soldier saying, I've sent my wife off because we need to earn some money. Now, where do these women live? The soldiers' wives, dependents, the people who run the inns, women perhaps, the people who make clothes, who serve the beer. Where do they live? Well, this is a fort on Hamer's Wall, and this is the fort down here, and the grey bits are all the foundations of houses. And we can see that the town outside the fort is even bigger than the fort, and we presume that this would be where the soldiers' dependents live. This depiction is interesting because it shows us houses outside the fort. What we've got are 2 buildings. This looks like an inn. There are 3 soldiers here quaffing beer. There's a shop of some kind here where the woman is serving. There's another woman down here, perhaps a retired veteran. Children. So, when we're thinking about women on the frontier, we've got to imagine women doing a lot of normal jobs that we would see today. But what happened when their man, their soldier husband, was outposted somewhere else? opening a shop with children, she might think, I'm just going to stay here. I've got a business to run. I've got children to look after. I don't want them to go off somewhere else. There's perhaps some sort of schooling they do here. She would want to probably stay at home. This is a mark castle, a little structure on Haven's Wall, which might have looked something like this. Then we have them on the Antonine Wall as well. And in this particular case we're looking at, there's a tombstone of a man called Dagvalda, and it records his wife, who's called Lucina. So she appears to be there with him at this outpost. How you still have to make a judgment. How long is he going to be there? Is it worth up sticks and moving? Now, we know that soldiers went on outpost duty for 3 years and more in some cases. So we've got evidence from the eastern frontier in this area that soldiers are outposted for at least 3 years. We have other evidence that they were outposted for just a few months or weeks. And soldiers would also be away, as I said, continuing to collect supplies. Well, you know he's coming back, but if the boat's going to be outposted for 3 years, you might want to go with it. There's a judgment to be made by the woman as to whether she's going to follow her loan. And if he was outposted there, would you want to go? Not a stand. And some of these are very far distant. This is the frontier that we looked at a moment ago. These outposts are right up the waddies here and here, a very long distance away from the safety of the Roman Empire. We have some evidence for outposts in Britain which are perhaps not so far distant from the frontier, actually within the frontier, but still out of the way. So what we're looking at is northern Britain. Here on this road, I don't know if you've ever been on the A66 across, it's the closest my parents ever came to death. They came up the rise and coming towards them were 2 lorries. Luckily there was a hard shoulder, they moved off. But it's up on the tops of Stainwell, really out of the way, and here, right on the very top, there's a small Roman outpost. And next to this outpost, this is it, Raven Castle, here, right up on the very top. And here, next to the Falkland, which is top left, we've got some buildings down here at the bottom right, suggesting that people are living outside the fort, presumably dependents of the servants inside the fort. Really out of the way place. You could also keep in contact if your bloke was away by letter. This is one of the documents from Vinderland, which just reminds us of an ancient author said, if you want to join the Roman army, you really need to be able to write. It works by collecting the bureaucracy. If you want to understand the Roman army, just remember that the soldiers could issue receipts in quadruplicate. That's how bureaucratic it was. And one of the interesting bits of research going on at the moment is soldiers in retirement turning up where you would not expect them to be. And one aspect of this might be because they're keeping in touch by writing letters to each other. Vinderlander has produced a postscript, written, as it happens, by an officer's wife in her own handwriting. But the rest of the letter was written by a scribe. So you didn't need to be able to write yourself to be able to keep in contact with your bloke 100 miles away on outpost duty. You could get the scribe to write a letter and keep in contact that way. Now we're back to our two soldiers. We're back to our civil community of people outside the fort. We're back to the warmth of the relationship. Does this play a part? This one next up. Okay. We're back to our civil communities, which have a lot of people living in them. And we're back to our family. So the woman has to make a choice. How long is he going to be away? Will this affect what I'm doing? Remember those 2,000 prostitutes? How much do I trust him? And all of those considerations must have come into the minds of the women who were married or who lived with Roman soldiers, relating themselves to his